It started with a scream, a sharp, piercing cry that cut through the humid summer air like a razor. The sound was so raw, so immediate that every person within earshot froze. A child had fallen into the gorilla enclosure. From above, the jagged rocks and dense foliage seemed like a fortress. But inside, it was another world entirely. Towering walls of concrete, shadows dancing across the dirt floor, and an unshakable sense of wild unpredictability. No one moved at first. The crowd of onlookers seemed paralyzed, their collective gasps hanging in the air like fragile glass about to shatter. Mothers clutched their children closer. Fathers stepped instinctively toward the edge of the railing, arms reaching out as if they could somehow close the impossible distance to the small, crumpled figure below. The boy lay motionless, his tiny frame dwarfed by the looming figure of a silverback gorilla named Juma. At nearly 500 pounds, Juma was the undisputed king of his domain. His shoulders were broad as boulders, his arms thick with unyielding muscle. He moved with an almost hypnotic grace, each step deliberate, calculated. And now, he was approaching the child. From the viewing platform above, it was impossible not to feel the weight of what might come next. The air was electric with tension. A zookeeper's voice crackled over the intercom, urging calm, but the words felt like static against the chaos unraveling in everyone's minds. Parents whispered prayers, eyes darting between the boy and the gorilla, between hope and dread. Juma knelt, his massive knuckles pressed into the dirt as he examined the small intruder in his space. There was a moment, an unbearable eternity, when it seemed like time itself had stopped. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, against all odds, Juma extended one hand. It was not a gesture of force, but of curiosity, even tenderness. His fingers, so large they could envelop the child entirely, hovered just inches from the boy's back. The sight of it, this enormous creature showing such restraint, sent ripples of disbelief through the crowd. The gorilla tilted his head, his dark, intelligent eyes scanning the boy as if trying to understand the fragility before him. What no one knew yet, what no one could possibly understand, was that this moment would not only define Juma, but change the lives of everyone who bore witness to his quiet act of bravery. Juma's fingers brushed the boy's arm, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd above. The touch was gentle, far gentler than anyone expected from a creature of his size. His thick, leathery hand rested for a moment, and then he nudged the boy lightly, as if urging him to move. But the boy didn't stir. His small frame remained limp, his face pale against the brown earth. The distant cries of his frantic mother pierced the tension, but her words were swallowed by the growing unease in the pit of every observer's stomach. Above, the zookeepers were scrambling. They leaned over railings, radios crackling as they debated the safest way to intervene. A tranquilizer could take time. Entering the enclosure could escalate the situation. Every option felt like a gamble. Below, Juma's gaze shifted, scanning the faces peering down at him. His expression held no aggression, only a quiet intensity. Then, in a move that defied everything they thought they knew about animal behavior, Juma stood and turned, shielding the boy with his enormous body. It was an act of possession, perhaps even protection. The scene unfolded like a slow-motion dream. Juma's enormous frame cast a long shadow over the child, his silver fur catching the dappled sunlight filtering through the enclosure's canopy. He sat down, his posture deliberate, as if daring the world to challenge him. Suddenly, another movement broke the stillness. A second gorilla, a younger female named Kina, approached from the far side of the enclosure. The spectators tensed as her curious gaze fell on the boy. She moved quickly, her lithe frame a stark contrast to Juma's massive presence. For a moment, it seemed like chaos might erupt. But Juma intervened. With a deep, guttural sound, a rumble that reverberated through the enclosure, he held up his hand, palm out. It was a gesture so eerily human that it drew audible gasps from the onlookers. Kina paused, her head cocking to the side, as if in understanding. Then she backed away, melting into the foliage. Above, the zookeepers exchanged hurried glances, their faces lined with worry. One of them, a man in his late 50s named Carl, was already descending the emergency ladder, his heart pounding with the weight of what he might face. The crowd surged against the barriers, phones raised, capturing every moment. Juma leaned forward, his movements slow and deliberate. With surprising care, he slipped his arm beneath the boy's fragile body and lifted him. The crowd erupted, some with shouts of alarm, others with cries of disbelief. Cradling the child against his chest, Juma moved to the farthest corner of the enclosure, where a shallow stream trickled over smooth stones. He stopped at the water's edge and crouched low, his eyes scanning the boy's face for signs of life. Gently, he dipped his free hand into the cool water and brought it to the boy's forehead, letting the droplets trickle down his temple. It was a motion so tender, so deliberate, that it silenced the frantic murmur of the crowd above. Juma sat there, his enormous form hunched protectively over the child, as if guarding the boy from the invisible forces that had brought him to this place. Above, Carl reached the enclosure floor, his hands shaking as he approached. "Juma," he called softly, his voice steady but lined with the weight of years spent working with these creatures. "Easy, boy, easy." Juma's head turned slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Carl's. For a moment, the tension between man and beast was almost tangible. Then, with an astonishing calm, Juma rose to his full height, the boy still cradled in his arm. Juma stood motionless, rising above Carl. Carl is motionless, his outstretched arms tremble slightly. Each muscle in his body is tense to the limit, and it was necessary not to provoke any sudden reaction. The air was dense with an almost unbearable smell. The heartbeat gave into the body echoing like a drum. Then, Juma did something no one expected. He took one slow step forward. The ground beneath his massive feet seemed to vibrate, but his movements were measured, deliberate. He stopped a mere few feet from Carl, lowering his head as if to study him. The boy's arm dangled limply from Juma's embrace, his tiny fingers brushing against the coarse fur of the gorilla's chest. Carl swallowed hard, his mind racing through every protocol, every fragment of knowledge he'd ever absorbed about primates. But nothing could have prepared him for this moment. "Juma," Carl said again, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "I'm here to help. Let me take him." Juma tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the zookeeper's words. Around them, the world seemed to fade into silence. The crowd above held their breath, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. Carl stepped closer, inch by inch, until he was within arm's reach. Juma's grip on the boy tightened briefly, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. But then slowly, he crouched down and extended his massive arms, holding the child out toward Carl. It was an offering, tentative and careful, as though he understood the enormity of the gesture. Carl's hands shook as he reached forward, sliding his arms beneath the boy's fragile body. The moment the child was out of Juma's grasp, the gorilla stepped back, his eyes lingering on Carl, as if to ensure he would handle the boy with care. "Thank you," Carl whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The instant the boy was in Carl's arms, the enclosure erupted into movement. Zookeepers at the perimeter sprang into action, signaling for Carl to retreat, while others prepared to guide Juma back to a calmer space. But Juma didn't resist. He simply turned and lumbered away, settling into a patch of shade beneath a low-hanging branch. Carl carried the boy to the ladder, climbing with painstaking care, the crowd's cheers and cries a distant roar in his ears. When he reached the top, paramedics were waiting. They whisked the child away on a stretcher, his mother sobbing with relief as she ran to his side. But down in the enclosure, Juma sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the spot where the boy had lain. The crowd dispersed slowly, their murmurs filled with awe and disbelief. Above it all, the image of Juma's tender strength lingered, a reminder of the unexpected depth of connection between man and nature. Hours later, the zoo grounds were quieter, the crowds long gone. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the now empty gorilla enclosure. Juma remained in the same spot, his massive form still and contemplative. From the observation deck, Carl watched him, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. It wasn't the first time Carl had seen something remarkable in these animals. But this was different. Juma's behavior had been deliberate, intentional in a way that defied explanation. There was a quiet intelligence in his actions, a recognition of the boy's vulnerability. Carl's chest tightened as he thought about the trust Juma had shown, a trust he wasn't sure humanity deserved. Behind him, the zoo's director approached, her heels clicking softly against the concrete. "How's he doing?" she asked, her voice subdued. Carl didn't turn. "He hasn't moved much, just sitting there, like he's thinking." She sighed. "The boy's stable, mild concussion, a few scrapes, but he's going to be fine. His parents asked me to thank you." Carl finally turned, his face lined with exhaustion. "Thank me? It wasn't me down there. It was him." He gestured toward Juma. "He's the one who kept that kid alive." The director nodded, her expression unreadable. "The press is already swarming. They're calling it a miracle, but you know how these things go. People will turn it into a spectacle." Carl clenched his jaw, the thought filling him with unease. He turned back to the enclosure, his gaze falling on Juma, who now seemed almost lost in the fading light. He didn't do it for cameras or headlines. He did it because... He trailed off, struggling to find the words. Because he knew. Somehow, he just knew. The director placed a hand on Carl's shoulder. "We'll keep an eye on him. Make sure he's not overwhelmed." Carl nodded absently, his thoughts still on Juma. He watched as the gorilla finally rose, his movements slow, deliberate. Juma wandered to the far edge of the enclosure, where a cluster of low bushes provided cover. He settled there, his back to the world, as if retreating into his own solitude. That night, the zoo was silent. The animals settled into their routines, the nocturnal ones stirring as the diurnal ones slept. But in the gorilla habitat, Juma remained awake. He sat beneath the stars, his dark eyes reflecting the faint light of the moon. His enormous chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but there was a weight to his presence, a lingering echo of the day's events. In the distance, a soft rustle broke the quiet. It wasn't from another gorilla, nor from the wind threading through the trees. It came from beyond the enclosure, from the service path where Carl now stood, watching. Carl knew he shouldn't be there. The zoo had protocols, rules designed to keep both humans and animals safe. But something about today had drawn him back, had made him want to be near Juma again. With careful steps, he approached the edge of the enclosure. "You're a good one, you know that?" Carl said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Juma didn't turn, but his ears twitched, a small acknowledgement. For a long while, Carl stood there, feeling the cool night air against his skin. It wasn't a conversation, not in the traditional sense. But in the silence, there was understanding. The next morning brought the chaos Carl had feared. By dawn, reporters had gathered outside the zoo gates, their cameras poised and their microphones at the ready. The story had spread overnight. Headlines splashed across every major outlet. Hero gorilla saves. Child in stunning act of compassion. The zoo's phone lines were jammed with inquiries, and emails flooded the inboxes of the staff. Carl arrived early, slipping past the growing throng of journalists with his head down and his heart heavy. He'd seen stories like this before, how quickly the narrative could shift, how the same media lauding Juma today might tear him apart tomorrow. Inside the zoo, the atmosphere buzzed with unease. The staff whispered in corners, their conversations peppered with words like liability and publicity. Carl ignored them all, heading straight for the gorilla habitat. When he arrived, he found Juma sitting near the center of the enclosure, surrounded by the other gorillas. Kina sat close, her small frame dwarfed by his presence, while two juveniles played at a safe distance. It was a peaceful scene, yet Carl couldn't shake the weight of what was coming. "Morning, Juma," Carl said quietly, leaning against the railing. His voice carried a tone of familiarity, almost like greeting an old friend. Juma glanced his way, his dark eyes calm but watchful. "Carl," came a voice behind him, sharp and authoritative. He turned to see the director, her expression strained. "They're demanding a statement," she said, gesturing toward the distant crowd of reporters. "And the board's already talking about increasing visitor access to the gorillas. VIP tours, private sessions, you know the drill." Carl's stomach turned. "He's not a spectacle," he said firmly. "He's a living, breathing soul. And after what he did yesterday, he deserves our respect, not to be paraded around like some sideshow." The director's expression softened, but her voice remained practical. "I know you care, Carl, but this is bigger than just you and Juma now. The whole world is watching." Carl shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Let them watch. Let them learn something for once, but don't turn him into a commodity." Before the director could respond, a sudden commotion erupted from the far side of the enclosure. A loud cry, a juvenile gorilla's distressed call, pierced the air. Carl and the director both turned sharply, their attention snapping to the scene unfolding below. One of the younger gorillas, a mischievous male named Toto, had climbed too high on the rocky outcrop. The stone beneath him crumbled, sending him sliding down toward a shallow trench. The fall wasn't far, but the way he landed, awkwardly, his leg twisted beneath him, sent a jolt of panic through the other gorillas. Juma reacted instantly. He crossed the enclosure in a few powerful strides, his massive form moving with surprising agility. The other gorillas scattered, giving him space as he approached Toto. Carl held his breath, his hands gripping the railing tightly. Toto let out another plaintive cry, struggling to free his leg. Juma knelt beside him, his large hands moving with deliberate care. It was a scene eerily similar to the day before, though this time the stakes felt different. "He knows what he's doing," Carl murmured, half to himself, as he watched Juma gently lift Toto's leg. The young gorilla squirmed, but quickly stilled under Juma's firm yet calming presence. Kana approached cautiously, watching from a distance as Juma assessed the injury. When he finally stepped back, Toto stood on shaky legs, testing his weight before limping toward the shade. Juma followed closely, his protective gaze never wavering. The director exhaled slowly, breaking the silence. "He's remarkable," she said. Carl nodded, his eyes still fixed on Juma. "He's more than that," he replied. "He's teaching us what we've forgotten, how to care, how to protect, maybe even how to be better." By midday, the zoo's public relations team had set up a press briefing in front of the gorilla habitat. A podium stood flanked by microphones, cameras aimed and ready. Carl lingered on the outskirts, his discomfort palpable. He hated the spectacle of it all, how quickly the focus had shifted from Juma's extraordinary act to the frenzy of human attention. Inside the enclosure, Juma seemed unbothered. He sat in the shade, watching the world beyond the glass wall with his usual calm. The other gorillas stayed nearby, their movements a natural rhythm of curiosity and play. Carl's radio crackled to life, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Carl, can you head to the west gate? There's someone asking to speak with you. They say it's urgent." Carl frowned, glancing toward the podium where the director was preparing to address the press. He tapped his radio. "On my way." When Carl reached the west gate, he found a man and a woman waiting. They looked out of place among the bustling zoo staff and tourists, a somberness in their demeanor that immediately set them apart. The woman held a small bouquet of wildflowers, her hands trembling slightly. "Can I help you?" Carl asked cautiously. The man stepped forward, his face lined with worry. "You're Carl, right? The zookeeper who was with the gorilla yesterday?" Carl nodded. "That's me." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "We're the boy's parents," she said, her voice cracking. We had to come to thank you. And him." Carl's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this, not the raw gratitude, not the weight of their emotions. "How's your son?" he asked, his voice soft. "He's recovering," the man said. "Still a little shaken, but the doctors say he'll be okay." He paused, his eyes searching Carl's face. "But we've been talking, my wife and I, and we realized we never would have gotten him back if it weren't for that gorilla." The woman stepped closer, holding out the bouquet. "Can you give these to him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it sounds silly, but we want him to know how grateful we are." Carl hesitated, the gesture catching him off guard. He looked at the flowers, then at the couple. Their faces were etched with a mix of exhaustion and relief, the kind of emotion that left no room for cynicism. "I'll do my best," Carl said finally, taking the bouquet. The woman's lips trembled into a faint smile, and the man nodded in silent gratitude. Back at the enclosure, Carl stood at the edge of the viewing area, the flowers clutched in his hand. He felt a pang of awkwardness, unsure of how to present such a human token to an animal. But when he spotted Juma, resting beneath a tree, something in the gorilla's calm gaze gave him the courage to try. Carl stepped closer to the barrier, crouching down so he was at eye level with Juma. He held up the flowers, letting their bright petals catch the sunlight. "These are for you," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "From the boy's family." Juma's dark eyes flickered to the bouquet, then back to Carl. For a moment, he seemed uninterested, his massive head tilting slightly to the side. But then, with deliberate slowness, he rose and moved closer, his hulking frame casting a shadow over the barrier. Carl stayed perfectly still as Juma extended a hand, his fingers brushing against the flowers. The gorilla's touch was surprisingly delicate as he plucked a single bloom from the bouquet, holding it up to his face. He sniffed it briefly, then tucked it into the grass beside him. A quiet laugh escaped Carl's lips, a sound born of relief and awe. "You're something else, Juma," he said softly. The gorilla didn't respond, of course, but there was a sense of acknowledgement in his steady gaze. Carl stayed there for a long while, the weight of the day lifting slightly as he watched Juma rest with the simple beauty of the flowers beside him. The following days blurred into a strange rhythm of chaos and quiet. The story of Juma's actions continued to dominate headlines, and the zoo found itself at the center of global attention. Visitors arrived in droves, craning their necks for a glimpse of the hero gorilla. Carl hated it. To him, Juma wasn't a spectacle or a marketing opportunity. He was a profound mystery, a being whose actions carried a depth most people seemed too busy, or too shallow, to appreciate. Carl spent every free moment by the gorilla habitat, not out of obligation, but out of a growing sense of connection. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and bathed the enclosure in golden light, Carl lingered longer than usual. Most of the visitors had gone, and the zoo was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. Juma sat beneath his favorite tree, a spot where the earth was cool and the view expansive. Carl leaned against the railing, his eyes fixed on the gorilla. "You've got the whole world watching you, buddy," he murmured. "And here you are, like none of it even matters." Juma tilted his head slightly, his gaze drifting to Carl. It was moments like this that unsettled him, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him question everything he thought he knew about the line between humans and animals. Then, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, a soft, repetitive tapping. Carl turned, scanning the empty pathways, but saw no one. The tapping grew louder, its rhythm almost hypnotic, and it seemed to be coming from within the enclosure. Carl's heart quickened. He stepped closer to the railing, his eyes darting toward the source of the noise. It wasn't Juma. He was still, his massive frame like a statue beneath the tree. The other gorillas were scattered, their movements lazy and unhurried. The tapping grew sharper, more insistent, and Carl's unease deepened. He called over his shoulder to a nearby staff member. "Hey, do you hear that?" The woman paused mid-step, her brow furrowing. "Hear what?" Carl gestured toward the enclosure. "That tapping. It's coming from inside." She strained her ears, but after a few seconds, shook her head. "I don't hear anything. You okay, Carl?" He nodded absently, waving her off, though his stomach churned with a strange mix of curiosity and dread. The sound persisted, but now it carried a rhythm, almost like a deliberate pattern. Carl leaned further over the railing, trying to pinpoint its source. That's when he saw it. In the far corner of the enclosure, where the shadows stretched long and deep, a small pile of stones had been neatly stacked. At the top of the stack, a single stone trembled as if caught by an invisible hand. Then it tipped and fell, landing with a soft thud. Carl's breath hitched. He scanned the area, his eyes narrowing. None of the gorillas were near the pile. Juma was still under the tree, and the others lounged lazily near the stream. "Impossible," Carl whispered, his pulse racing. But as he watched, another stone moved, this time sliding down the stack with a deliberate slowness. Carl's skin prickled, a sensation of being watched creeping up his spine. He turned sharply, half expecting to see someone or something behind him, but the pathways were empty. When he looked back at the pile, it was still. No movement, no sound. Just an ordinary stack of rocks in the fading light. Juma stirred then, rising from his spot beneath the tree. He moved toward the pile, his gait slow but purposeful. Carl held his breath as the gorilla approached, towering over the stack. Juma paused, his eyes fixed on the stones, and then he did something that sent a chill through Carl's veins. He reached out, picked up one of the fallen stones, and gently placed it back on the stack. Carl stared, frozen in place, his breath caught in his throat. Juma's massive fingers moved with an elegance that seemed out of sync with his size, his actions deliberate and unhurried. The gorilla adjusted the stone, placing it carefully back atop the stack before retreating a few steps to sit, his dark eyes fixed on the small structure. "What are you doing, buddy?" Carl whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the evening breeze. Juma didn't look at Carl, but there was a weight in his posture, a kind of contemplative stillness that felt almost human. Carl shook his head, trying to dismiss the unsettling thought. He'd worked with animals for years, had seen behaviors that defied easy explanation. But this felt different. It wasn't instinct or habit. It was intentional. That night, long after the zoo had closed and the last of the staff had left, Carl found himself unable to sleep. The image of Juma and the stones lingered in his mind, replaying over and over like a loop he couldn't break. Finally, he threw on a jacket and grabbed his keys. The zoo was eerily quiet when Carl arrived, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. He parked his truck and made his way to the gorilla habitat, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. When he reached the enclosure, he hesitated, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease. The moon hung low, casting pale light across the landscape, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than usual. Carl stepped closer to the barrier, peering into the enclosure. Juma was awake. The gorilla sat by the pile of stones, his silhouette massive against the faint glow of the moon. Carl crouched by the railing, his flashlight off, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening. He watched as Juma reached for another stone, placing it with the same meticulous care he'd shown earlier. Carl's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't random. It wasn't play. Juma was building something. "What are you trying to tell us?" Carl murmured, his voice barely audible. Juma paused, his hand resting on a stone. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if he'd heard Carl, as if he was considering an answer. Then he continued, adding another stone to the stack. Carl stayed there for hours, watching as Juma worked in silence. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the pile had grown taller, its shape more defined. It wasn't just a stack anymore. It was a structure, symmetrical, deliberate, almost architectural. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Carl turned sharply to see one of the morning keepers approaching, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Carl? What are you doing here?" He gestured toward the enclosure. "Look." She followed his gaze, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of Juma and his creation. "Is he building something?" "I don't know," Carl admitted, "but it's not random. There's a pattern to it." The keeper stepped closer, her voice hushed. "Do you think he's trying to communicate? Like with us?" Carl didn't answer. He couldn't. All he knew was that something extraordinary was unfolding, something that defied everything he thought he understood about the animals he'd dedicated his life to. Juma added one final stone to the structure, then sat back, his eyes scanning his work as if appraising it. The keeper gasped softly, and Carl felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. The structure wasn't just a random arrangement of stones. It was a shape, a pattern, a symbol, and it was unmistakably deliberate. Carl's breath caught as he stared at the structure. The pattern wasn't intricate, but it was precise, an unmistakable triangle made of stacked stones. Its simplicity made it even more unsettling, a deliberate geometric form in a place where randomness should have reigned. The keeper beside him whispered, "Carl, that's not just a coincidence. That's—" She trailed off, struggling to find words. Carl nodded, his eyes never leaving the triangle. "I know. It's intentional." Juma sat a few feet away from his creation, his massive frame at ease, but his gaze sharp, focused. His posture radiated a calm authority, as if he were saying, "Look, understand." Carl leaned against the railing, his mind racing. Was this behavior documented in other gorillas? Could this be an outlier, an anomaly unique to Juma? Or was there something deeper, something they'd missed all along in their years of observing and categorizing these magnificent creatures? The keeper broke the silence. "We need to document this. Get the cameras, bring the others." "No." Carl's voice was firm, almost harsh. He turned to her, his expression resolute. "Not yet. This isn't for a spectacle. Let's try to understand it first." The keeper hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we can't keep this under wraps forever." Carl knew she was right. The world would demand answers, explanations, but for now, this was his moment with Juma. A moment that felt sacred, almost like stepping into a shared secret. That evening, Carl sat in his small office, poring over research papers and behavioral studies. He combed through articles, watched countless videos, and scoured scientific journals, but nothing came close to what he'd witnessed. Gorillas were known for their intelligence, their capacity for problem-solving and empathy. But creating a symbolic structure? This was new. His desk phone rang, breaking his concentration. He answered it reluctantly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "This is Carl." "Carl, it's the director." Her tone was clipped, professional. "I just got a call from the board. They've approved VIP tours starting next week. They want Juma to be the centerpiece." Carl gripped the phone tighter, his frustration boiling over. "He's not a sideshow act. He's the reason the zoo is getting record attention," she interrupted. "I don't like it any more than you do. But this is bigger than us now. You need to be ready." Carl slammed the phone down, his chest heaving with anger. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The weight of it all, the media, the board, the public, felt suffocating. And yet, at the center of it was Juma, silent and steadfast, building his mysterious structures. The next morning, Carl arrived early, determined to observe Juma before the zoo opened. As he approached the enclosure, he stopped short, his heart skipping a beat. The triangle was gone. In its place was a new structure, larger, more intricate. This time, it resembled a pyramid, its sides carefully sloped and its base wider. The stones were stacked with precision, their placement almost architectural. Carl felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just an experiment or idle play. This was a progression, a deliberate evolution of form. Juma wasn't just building, he was creating. The gorilla sat nearby, watching Carl with that same steady gaze. It was as if he was waiting for a reaction, a response, an acknowledgement. Carl approached the barrier, his voice low and uncertain. "What are you trying to say, Juma? What's the message?" Juma tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the morning light. He didn't move, but Carl felt the weight of his presence, the unspoken dialogue that hung heavy between them. Carl turned away, his thoughts racing. He needed help, someone who could analyze this behavior, decode its meaning. But he also knew that bringing in outside experts would open a floodgate he might never be able to close. For now, he resolved to keep watching, to keep learning. Because whatever Juma was doing, it felt important, urgent even. and Carl wasn't ready to let the noise of the world drown it out. Carl paced his office, the weight of Juma's actions pressing heavily on his mind. The pyramid wasn't just a structure. It was a message, a deliberate act meant to convey something beyond his understanding. The implications gnawed at him. How could he explain this to anyone without sounding unhinged? He decided to take a leap of faith. Pulling out his phone, he called an old colleague, Dr. Eleanor Marks, a primatologist with a reputation for challenging conventional wisdom about animal intelligence. Eleanor was pragmatic, sharp, and not easily swayed by sensationalism. "Carl," she answered, after a few rings, her voice laced with curiosity. "It's been a while. What's going on?" "I need your help," Carl began, his voice tinged with urgency. "It's about Juma." "Your star gorilla," Eleanor chuckled. "I've seen the headlines. What's he done now?" "It's not what he's done, it's how he's doing it. I need you to see this for yourself." Eleanor hesitated. "This isn't some publicity stunt, is it? You know how I feel about—" "Eleanor, trust me," Carl interrupted. "This isn't about the media. It's something unprecedented." The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the zoo, her presence a blend of skepticism and intrigue. Carl greeted her at the entrance, his expression grim. "You're making me nervous," she said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "What am I about to see?" Carl didn't respond immediately, leading her to the gorilla enclosure in silence. When they arrived, Juma was already at work, his massive hands placing stones with careful precision. The pyramid from the previous day had been dismantled, and a new structure was taking shape. This one even more complex, with interlocking layers and a distinct symmetry. Eleanor's jaw dropped. She stepped closer to the railing, her eyes wide as she took in the sight. "Carl, this isn't normal." "I know," Carl said quietly. "That's why I called you." Eleanor watched in silence for several minutes, her analytical mind racing. Finally, she turned to Carl. "Has he done this before?" "Not like this. It started a few days ago, with a simple triangle. Now it's evolved into whatever this is." Eleanor leaned on the railing, her voice a whisper. "This isn't instinct or play behavior. This is intentional, purposeful." Carl nodded. "That's what I've been trying to tell everyone. But no one wants to listen. They're too busy turning him into a media sensation." Eleanor straightened, her expression resolute. "We need to document this properly, not for the media, but for science. This could redefine what we know about primate cognition." Over the next few days, Eleanor and Carl worked tirelessly to observe and record Juma's behavior. They installed cameras around the enclosure, capturing every movement, every deliberate placement of a stone. As the structures grew more intricate, so did their questions. What was driving Juma to build? Was he imitating something he'd seen, or was this an entirely original behavior? And most haunting of all, was he trying to communicate? One night, as they reviewed footage in Carl's office, Eleanor paused the video and leaned back in her chair. "There's a rhythm to it," she said, pointing at the screen. "He's not just stacking stones randomly. There's a pattern, almost like he's following a blueprint." Carl stared at the screen, his brow furrowed. "A blueprint for what?" Eleanor didn't answer immediately, her mind lost in thought. Finally she said, "We might not be able to figure this out on our own. We need more eyes on this. Anthropologists, linguists, even architects. If Juma's creating something meaningful, we have to understand it." Carl sighed, rubbing his temples. "Bringing in more people means more attention, more scrutiny. Are we ready for that?" Eleanor met his gaze. "If we don't, we risk losing the chance to learn something extraordinary." Carl nodded reluctantly. "All right, let's do it." As the days turned into weeks, Juma's creations continued to captivate and baffle everyone who saw them. The zoo became a hub of activity, with experts from various fields arriving to study the enigmatic gorilla and his mysterious structures. But amidst the chaos, one question loomed larger than all the others. What was Juma trying to tell them? The buzz around Juma's behavior reached a fever pitch as experts from various disciplines converged on the zoo. Researchers set up observation stations, linguists analyzed patterns, and architects marveled at the structural integrity of Juma's creations. The zoo's once quiet atmosphere was now a whirlwind of activity and debate. Carl felt increasingly distant from it all. While others sought to quantify and analyze, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something deeper, something unmeasurable. Every time he watched Juma, it felt less like observation and more like witnessing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last researchers packed up for the day, Carl decided to stay behind. He found himself drawn to the enclosure, unable to resist the pull of Juma's silent work. He crouched near the edge of the barrier, watching as the gorilla placed the final stone on his latest creation. This one was unlike the others. The structure was tall, its base wide and sturdy, tapering upward to a sharp point. It resembled an obelisk, its sides marked by subtle indentations that seemed purposeful, though their meaning was unclear. The sight of it sent a chill down Carl's spine. "What are you building, Juma?" he whispered. "And why?" For the first time, Juma looked directly at Carl after completing a structure. There was something in his gaze, a weight and intensity that made Carl's breath catch. The gorilla's dark eyes seemed to hold an unspoken truth, a question that begged an answer. Carl leaned closer to the railing. "Is this for us or for you?" Juma didn't move. The moment stretched, heavy with significance, until the gorilla finally turned away, retreating to his usual resting spot. Carl exhaled shakily, feeling as though he'd just passed a test he didn't understand. The next morning, Carl found Eleanor waiting at his office, her face pale and her eyes wide. She held a tablet in her hands, the screen glowing with an image of Juma's latest creation. "Carl, we ran some image recognition software on the obelisk," she said, her voice trembling. "It matched something." Carl frowned. "What do you mean?" Eleanor handed him the tablet. "Look." On the screen was a side-by-side comparison, Juma's structure and an ancient artifact, a centuries-old stone obelisk from a remote region of Africa. The resemblance was uncanny. The shape, the proportions, even the subtle indentations were almost identical. Carl's head spun. "That's impossible. How could he know?" "I don't know," Eleanor interrupted, "but this can't be a coincidence." They stared at the screen in silence, the implications crashing over them like a tidal wave. If Juma's creation was more than instinct, more than play, then what was it? A memory? A message? As the days passed, the mystery deepened. Juma's creations became more intricate, more purposeful, and each seemed to echo a piece of humanity's distant past. Scholars began to speculate wildly. Was this evidence of some shared ancestral memory? A form of intelligence beyond their understanding? For Carl, the theories were irrelevant. All that mattered was the connection he felt each time he watched Juma at work. It was as if the gorilla was offering a bridge between worlds, a glimpse into something profound and unknowable. But as Juma's creations grew more elaborate, so did the public frenzy. The zoo was inundated with visitors, reporters, and sponsors eager to capitalize on the phenomenon. Carl's worst fears were realized as Juma became less of a creature and more of a spectacle. One evening, as Carl stood alone by the enclosure, Juma approached him. The gorilla's movements were slow, deliberate, and his eyes held that same inscrutable weight. He reached out, his massive hand resting briefly on the ground, then retreated to his resting spot. Carl stepped closer, his heart pounding. Where Juma's hand had been, there was now a small arrangement of stones, simple, unassuming, yet deliberate. It wasn't a structure or a symbol, it was a line that pointed out of the enclosure. Carl's mind raced as he stared at the line of stones. It wasn't like Juma's other creations, grand, intricate structures that seemed to echo ancient artistry. This was simple, almost stark in its directness, and yet it carried an unmistakable weight, as if it held the answer to a question Carl had yet to ask. The line pointed beyond the enclosure, toward the dense thicket of trees that bordered the zoo's grounds. Carl glanced at Juma, who was now sitting in the corner of the enclosure, watching him with a calm yet expectant gaze. It was as though the gorilla was waiting for him to act. Carl whispered, under his breath, "What are you trying to tell me?" The following morning, he couldn't shake the image of the stones. He decided to share it with Eleanor, hoping her insight might illuminate what he couldn't yet see. She studied the photograph he'd taken, her brow furrowing in concentration. "It's directional," she said finally. "It's pointing somewhere. The question is, where?" "That's what I want to find out," Carl replied. "I think it's outside the enclosure, maybe even beyond the zoo grounds." Eleanor's expression grew cautious. "You're suggesting we follow it?" Carl nodded. "I know it sounds crazy, but Juma doesn't do anything without intention. If he's pointing us somewhere, we need to find out why." Eleanor hesitated, then said, "All right, but if we do this, we do it carefully. We can't risk losing control of the situation." That evening, long after the zoo had closed and the crowds had dispersed, Carl and Eleanor ventured toward the thicket with flashlights in hand. The cool night air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the hum of insects. Every step felt deliberate, the darkness around them amplifying their sense of purpose. Carl led the way, his flashlight beam scanning the ground for any sign of a trail. "It's this way," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the night. After several minutes of walking, Eleanor stopped abruptly. "Wait," she said, shining her light ahead. "There." In the distance, a faint glimmer of reflected light caught Carl's attention. He stepped closer, and as the beam illuminated the ground, his breath caught. Another line of stones. Unlike the one in Juma's enclosure, this line was longer and slightly curved, its path leading deeper into the thicket. The stones were arranged with the same precision, their placement too deliberate to be random. "What is this?" Eleanor whispered, her voice tinged with awe. Carl shook his head. "I don't know, but we're following it." The trail of stones led them further into the forest, the path winding and uneven. Carl's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and unease. Each stone felt like a breadcrumb in a story he was only beginning to understand. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing, the moonlight casting an eerie glow over the scene. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone slab, weathered and ancient, its surface etched with faint, worn markings. Carl approached it cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the carvings. They were faint but unmistakable, patterns and symbols that echoed the structures Juma had been building. Eleanor joined him, her voice trembling. "Carl, this is old, very old." Carl ran his fingers over the carvings, the cool stone rough beneath his touch. How could Juma know about this? How could he lead us here? Eleanor didn't answer. Her silence spoke volumes. As they stood in the clearing, a sound broke the stillness, a low, guttural rumble that sent shivers down Carl's spine. He turned sharply, his flashlight beam sweeping the darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tight. Eleanor nodded, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "We're not alone." The realization struck Carl like a bolt of lightning. They weren't just uncovering a mystery. They were stepping into something far larger, far older, and far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a rustling, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Carl and Eleanor exchanged a glance. Their unspoken fears mirrored in each other's eyes. Whatever was out there, it was coming closer. Carl tightened his grip on the flashlight and took a cautious step toward the sound. "Stay here," he murmured to Eleanor, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? We should go back now." "We can't," Carl said firmly, though his own fear gnawed at him. "We've come too far. If we leave, we might never understand what this is." Reluctantly, Eleanor nodded, her flashlight sweeping nervously across the clearing. Carl moved forward, each step deliberate, his heart pounding like a drum. The trees loomed around him, their shadows twisting and shifting in the faint moonlight. And then he saw it. A pair of eyes glinting in the darkness just beyond the edge of the clearing. They were large, reflective, and unblinking. Carl froze, the beam of his flashlight steady as he tried to make out the shape behind them. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The eyes didn't move. For a long moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, with agonizing slowness, the figure stepped forward. It wasn't human. A gorilla emerged from the shadows. Not Juma, but another, larger, more imposing. Its fur was darker, almost black, and its gaze was penetrating, as if it could see through Carl and into the very core of him. The creature carried an aura of authority, a primal intelligence that sent a chill down Carl's spine. Behind it, more shadows shifted. Carl realized with a start that there wasn't just one gorilla. There were several, their massive forms blending with the darkness. "Eleanor," Carl whispered, his voice barely audible. "Stay calm." Eleanor took a step closer, her own flashlight revealing the sheer size of the group. The gorillas surrounded the clearing, their silent presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The largest one, the leader, Carl assumed, stepped forward again. It glanced briefly at the stone slab before turning its gaze back to Carl. There was no hostility in its expression, only curiosity and something deeper, a sense of purpose. Eleanor's voice was a hushed whisper. "This isn't random. They're guarding it." "Guarding what?" Carl asked, though he already knew the answer. The slab, the carvings, the trail of stones, everything led back to this moment, to this place. Whatever it was important, sacred. The leader raised its hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed, not at Carl, but at the stone slab. Then it stepped back, retreating into the shadows along with the others. Within moments, the clearing was empty again, the forest silent, as if nothing had happened. Carl and Eleanor stood frozen, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them. "What just happened?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice trembling. Carl turned back to the slab, his flashlight illuminating the carvings. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I think they want us to understand." For the next hour, Carl and Eleanor examined the slab more closely. The carvings were intricate, forming patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. There were spirals, lines, and shapes that suggested some kind of language or code. Eleanor took photographs, her hands shaking. "This is extraordinary. It's not just art, it's communication." Carl nodded, his mind racing. "Juma's been trying to show us this. All his structures, they were leading us here." "But why?" Eleanor asked. "What does it mean?" Before Carl could respond, a faint glow caught his attention. He turned to see that the carvings on the slab were beginning to shimmer, as if activated by some unseen force. The glow grew brighter, casting an otherworldly light across the clearing. Carl and Eleanor stepped back, their breaths caught in their throats. The slab seemed to hum, its surface vibrating faintly. The light coalesced into a shape, a symbol, hovering above the stone. Carl stared at it, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It was as if the slab was alive, responding to their presence. "This is impossible," Eleanor whispered. "Maybe," Carl said. "Or maybe we just don't understand what's possible." The glowing symbol hovered above the slab, its light pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Carl and Eleanor stood frozen, caught between awe and a visceral, primal fear. The clearing seemed to hum, with an energy neither of them could describe, an electric tension that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Eleanor broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Carl, this can't be natural. This isn't... It's something else," Carl finished, his eyes fixed on the symbol. It shimmered like liquid light, its shape shifting subtly, as if alive. Something we've never seen before. The symbol grew brighter, its edges sharp and defined now. Carl felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if it was calling him. Without thinking, he took a step forward, his hand reaching out toward the light. "Carl, wait!" Eleanor hissed, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what it is. It could be dangerous." Carl stopped, glancing back at her. "I don't think it's here to harm us. Look at the gorillas. They weren't afraid. They were showing us this. That doesn't mean we should just..." Eleanor stopped mid-sentence as the light pulsed again, this time accompanied by a low, melodic hum. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, vibrating in their bones, resonating in their chests. Carl stepped closer to the slab, his curiosity overriding his fear. He placed his hand on the cool surface of the stone, and instantly the symbol shifted, the light intensifying. Images flashed through his mind, rapid, fragmented visions of dense forests, rushing rivers, and skies filled with stars. He saw hands, both human and not, working together to build, to create, to connect. And then he saw Juma. The gorilla's face was serene, his eyes filled with an intelligence that felt almost human. Behind him, other figures emerged, humans and gorillas, side by side, their hands intertwined as they worked on something monumental. The vision was fleeting, but its meaning was unmistakable. Unity, collaboration, a shared history. Carl pulled his hand away, gasping for breath. The glow faded slightly, though the symbol remained. He turned to Eleanor, his voice trembling. I think this is a message. Juma, the others, they're trying to show us something we've forgotten." Eleanor's eyes were wide, her face pale. "Forgotten? What are you talking about?" Carl pointed to the slab. "This isn't just a relic. It's a connection. Between us and them. Between the past and the present. They're trying to remind us of who we are. Who we were." Eleanor stared at the slab, then back at Carl. "If that's true, then what do we do now? How do we even begin to understand this?" Carl looked back at the symbol, its light still pulsing softly. "We start by listening." The following days were a blur of activity. Carl and Eleanor returned to the zoo with their findings, carefully documenting every detail of the slab and the glowing symbol. They reached out to experts in anthropology, linguistics, and even physics, seeking anyone who could help decode the meaning of what they had found. News of the discovery spread quickly, and the zoo became the center of a global phenomenon. Crowds gathered daily, hoping for a glimpse of Juma or the mysterious symbol. The media spun theories ranging from alien intervention to lost civilizations, but Carl remained focused on the gorillas. "They're the key," he told Eleanor one evening as they reviewed their notes. "Juma and the others. They know more than we think. We have to keep watching them, learning from them." Eleanor nodded, though her expression was troubled. "But how much time do we have? The more people hear about this, the more pressure there'll be. Sponsors, governments, researchers, they'll all want a piece of this." Carl sighed, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. "Then we need to act quickly. Whatever this is, it's bigger than us. We owe it to them and to ourselves to find the truth." Late one night, Carl returned to the gorilla enclosure alone. Juma was awake, sitting near the edge of the barrier, his massive frame illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. Carl approached quietly, feeling an unspoken understanding pass between them. "I saw it," Carl said softly. "The vision. I saw what you wanted to show me." Juma's dark eyes met Carl's, and for a moment it felt as though they were communicating without words. The gorilla reached down, picking up a small stone, and began arranging it with others in a pattern on the ground. Carl watched intently, his heart pounding. The pattern was simple yet deliberate, a series of concentric circles that mirrored one of the carvings on the slab. "You're teaching us, aren't you?" Carl whispered. "You're showing us the way." Juma placed the final stone, then looked up at Carl, his expression calm yet powerful. Carl felt a surge of determination. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning. The days following that quiet encounter with Juma marked the start of something Carl could only describe as transformative. The patterns Juma created in the dirt, the deliberate placement of stones and branches, all of it began to take on a new resonance. It wasn't random, nor was it merely symbolic. Juma was communicating, though the full scope of his message remained tantalizingly out of reach. Carl and Eleanor devoted themselves to decoding Juma's creations. They enlisted experts in primate behavior, symbolic language, and even ancient anthropology. Each theory seemed to bring them closer to understanding, yet every answer only opened new questions. The zoo, once a relatively quiet place, was now a bustling epicenter of media attention. The public was captivated by the mystery of the glowing slab and Juma's apparent role in leading Carl and Eleanor to it. Crowds gathered daily, their faces pressed against the glass of the gorilla enclosure, cameras at the ready. But amid the growing frenzy, Carl felt the tension mounting. He saw it in Juma's eyes, an unspoken urgency. Whatever the gorilla was trying to convey, it wasn't just a lesson or a story. It was a call to action. One evening, Carl stayed late, the zoo silent under a canopy of stars. He sat near the edge of Juma's enclosure, sketchpad in hand, recording the latest pattern Juma had created. The circles had evolved, now intersecting in ways that seemed to hint at something more complex, something alive. The faint sound of movement caught Carl's attention. He looked up to see Juma watching him from the shadows, his massive form almost blending into the night. Slowly, Juma approached, his gaze steady and intent. Carl held his breath as the gorilla stopped just feet away. Juma reached down, his hand brushing the dirt. With deliberate movements, he began to draw. This time, the pattern was different, an intricate series of lines and shapes that Carl couldn't immediately comprehend. "What is it?" Carl murmured, his voice barely audible. Juma paused, his dark eyes meeting Carl's. The gorilla's gaze seemed to hold the weight of centuries, a depth that made Carl's chest tighten. Then, with a final sweep of his hand, Juma completed the pattern. Carl stared at it, his mind racing. The shapes weren't abstract, they were familiar. He recognized them as constellations, their alignment unmistakable. "Stars," Carl whispered, "you're showing me the stars." The following morning, Carl shared his discovery with Eleanor and the team of researchers who had become part of their mission. They studied the pattern Juma had drawn, comparing it to star charts and astronomical data. What they found left them stunned. The constellation Juma had drawn wasn't random. It corresponded to a specific region of the sky. And within that region lay a star system known for its unusual activity, including bursts of energy scientists had yet to explain. "It's a map," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Juma's pointing us to something out there." "But how could he know?" one of the researchers asked, voicing the question that lingered in everyone's minds. Carl didn't have an answer. All he knew was that Juma's message was clear. There was something beyond the confines of their understanding, something worth seeking. As the days turned into weeks, Carl and Eleanor worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. They studied ancient texts, consulted with astronomers, and analyzed Juma's behavior. Each new discovery felt like another step along a path that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Meanwhile, Juma's patterns grew more intricate. He began incorporating new materials, leaves, sticks, even water, into his creations. Each design seemed to pulse with meaning, as if Juma's urgency was growing. And then, one day, it happened. Carl was in the enclosure, observing Juma's latest work, when the gorilla suddenly stopped. Juma turned to Carl, his eyes intense, and pointed to the sky. At first, Carl didn't understand. Then he saw it, a light, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the blue expanse above. It wasn't a plane or a satellite. It was something else, something that didn't belong. Carl felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at Juma, who was now watching him with an almost expectant expression. The message was clear. Whatever they were searching for, it was closer than they had ever imagined. The following days felt like the eye of a storm. The light Carl had seen in the sky wasn't just a fleeting anomaly. Reports of similar sightings came from around the globe, strange luminous patterns in the heavens, often aligned with Juma's constellations. News outlets speculated wildly, from natural phenomena to extraterrestrial intervention. But Carl knew this wasn't random. The gorilla had been pointing toward this moment all along. With growing urgency, Carl and Eleanor focused on Juma's next moves. Each new design seemed more intricate, more precise, as though building to something inevitable. Juma's behavior became increasingly focused. He no longer lingered near the crowds or played with the other gorillas. It was as if he knew time was running out. Late one evening, Carl stood by Juma's enclosure, watching as the gorilla constructed yet another pattern. This time it was different, sharper, with angles that mirrored geometric symbols Carl had only ever seen in historical texts. Eleanor joined him, carrying a tablet displaying their latest findings. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "We've been mapping Juma's designs against known locations, and it's not just constellations. These patterns are matching ancient sites across the globe: Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines, the Great Pyramids." Carl stared at her, the implications crashing over him like a wave. "Are you saying these places are connected?" "I don't think they're just connected," Eleanor said. "I think they're part of the same message. And whatever Juma is trying to show us, it's leading to something central. Something here." Their conversation was interrupted by a low, rumbling sound. Carl turned toward the enclosure and saw Juma standing still, his dark eyes fixed on the glowing slab. The light from the carvings was growing brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then, without warning, the slab began to shift. The ground trembled as the stone slowly split apart, revealing a hidden chamber beneath. A cool, bluish light spilled out, illuminating Juma's face. He turned toward Carl and Eleanor, his gaze almost commanding. Carl swallowed hard. "He wants us to follow." Eleanor hesitated. "We don't know what's down there. This could be dangerous." "It could be," Carl admitted, his voice steady. "But if we stop now, we might never know the truth." Together, they climbed into the chamber, the air growing cooler as they descended. The walls were smooth, carved with the same intricate patterns as the slab above. At the center of the chamber was an object, a crystalline structure, its surface shimmering with the same unearthly light. Juma stood beside it, his massive hand resting gently on its surface. The light seemed to respond, growing brighter as if alive. Carl stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. "It's beautiful." Eleanor studied the object, her scientific mind racing. "This isn't just a stone, it's something else, something engineered." The light pulsed again, filling the chamber with warmth. And then, for the first time, they heard it. A sound, low and melodic, like a song carried on the wind. It wasn't random. It was a pattern, a rhythm that spoke to something deep and ancient within them. As the melody filled the chamber, Carl felt a wave of emotion he couldn't explain. Joy, sadness, hope, and fear all at once. It was as if the music was unlocking something inside him, something long buried. Juma stepped back, his role seemingly complete. Carl hesitated, then placed his hand on the crystal. The light flared, and suddenly the chamber was filled with images, memories not his own. He saw vast forests teeming with life, ancient creatures moving in harmony with the world around them. He saw early humans and gorillas working side by side, their shared efforts building something magnificent, a society based on mutual respect and understanding. But then the vision shifted. He saw conflict, destruction, the bond between species breaking apart. The crystal was left buried, forgotten, waiting for someone to rediscover it. The images faded, and Carl staggered back, overwhelmed. "It's history," he said, his voice trembling. "Not just ours, but theirs too. We were connected once, and we lost it." Eleanor touched the crystal, her expression awestruck. "This isn't just a record. It's a guide. It's showing us what we can be, what we need to be." The melody changed, growing softer, more insistent. Carl realized it was pointing them toward the surface. He turned to Juma, who was already climbing back up the chamber's entrance. "What now?" Eleanor asked, following Carl's gaze. "We finished what he started," Carl said. Back at the surface, the slab's glow had spread, illuminating the surrounding forest. Crowds gathered at a safe distance, their faces lit with a mix of awe and fear. Carl and Eleanor stepped forward, Juma by their side. As the light grew brighter, the constellations Juma had drawn began to align in the sky. The luminous patterns they had seen weeks ago now formed a map above them, leading to something unseen but unmistakably near. In that moment, Carl felt the weight of everything they had uncovered. The crystal's message, Juma's guidance, the light in the sky, it all pointed to a single truth. They weren't alone. They never had been. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Carl knew their journey was only beginning. The world would never be the same. They weren't alone. They never had been. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Carl knew their journey was only beginning. The world would never be the same. Thank you for listening to our story. If you want to continue, write your wishes in the comments. If you like it, please like and subscribe to the channel. A lot of interesting stories ahead.